Welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast from the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. My name is Paul Jong. I'm the CEO of the PCA, and today we speak with Hugh Secord, Chief Strategist with Oakbridges Labour Relations Strategies. Welcome, Hugh.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, it's good to have you here, Hugh. You and I have known each other for some time. You've been in and around the industry. You're based in Ontario, but you've had activity out west, and a lot of work working with contractors and owners. But for our listeners, Hugh, why don't you give a bit of a thumbnail sketch about what you do at Oakbridges and perhaps a bit of a background or prior to that?
Sure. Well, thanks, Paul. As you said, I'm the Chief Strategist at Oakbridges Labour Relations Strategies. We were established about 12 years ago, and before that, got into consulting 21 years ago. I've been in labor relations my whole career, 45 years plus, but I found that going into consulting was a way to broaden my horizons and learn a lot about various industries and about Canada. So Oakbridges was formed to do precisely that. And as you mentioned, we are Ontario-based, but we've worked in literally every province and 2 of the 3 territories. So unfortunately, the only place we haven't worked is the Yukon, which is on our bucket list. But everywhere else, we've worked in the construction industry. We principally work for proponents, helping them to navigate through the various labor postures, understanding the difference between building trade unions and alternative unions and non-unions, and understanding labor supply issues, as well as just working out the logistics. Labor is a significant component of any project. 40% approximately of the cost of any project is labor, and more significantly, productivity issues and supply issues can absolutely affect the total capital cost. So we try to help them develop strategies to enhance productivity and overcome some of the issues that are common to projects. And we have a lot of fun doing it, and we've learned a lot, and it's a very dynamic industry, so it keeps us engaged.
Excellent. Well, later on at the end of the podcast, I'll ask you to provide our listeners with some information about how they can learn more about Oakbridges' work and contact you. But let's jump into some discussion here, Hugh, because based on that great description of your background, there's a few topics that I think are worthy of us to dive into. And the first is, kind of the labor supply. Most of our listeners would know, and you would know, that whether you get it from BuildForce or from other sources, there's a fairly, significant concern in Canada with respect to the supply of skilled trades, partly due to retirements out of the industry, but also kind of deselection of young people not perhaps going into trades as much as they might have in years past. And so we have this kind of labor gap. Currently, it's not that as big of an issue because the projects are relatively slow, but we've seen these waves come up and down, Hugh, over the years where suddenly the industry is scrambling to find workers. And now we have our federal government, I think to its credit, putting together a nation-building strategy and saying, hey, we have to build our infrastructure, both public and private. We need to grow. We need to strengthen our economy nationally and interprovincially. But lying underneath that, Hugh, is the real challenge. Do we have enough workers to do all this work? And I'd love you to share your thoughts about some of those concepts.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I believe we misplaced the emphasis on how to deal with the supply issue, and that is we focus on trying to encourage more entrants from non-traditional sources like women and Indigenous populations and others. And yet, I think the statistics have shown that we've had sufficient entrants at the apprenticeship level, but they don't complete their apprenticeships. And I think part of the problem, whether it's a problem with attraction or retention, is the fact that there isn't enough consistency in project activity. And so people aren't able to complete their apprenticeships. They get disgruntled, and they simply don't fill the pipeline and keep it consistently full. I mean, the success rate of apprenticeships is very, very low. And I think part of the problem we face right now is, as you said, that doesn't seem to be a big issue because demand seems to be fairly low right now. But there's a lot of latent interest in projects, and we're going to run into a problem. But the big problem is that I think investors are very leery about Canada right now because of the issues we have with our friends south of the border, but also our internal issues where we have a lot of squabbling between jurisdictions. We have a lot of talk about Alberta separation, Alberta and BC not getting along, Ontario saying, what about us? And I think this creates a very large discord in the environment that prevents us from getting on with these projects, which are vital to creating a Canadian identity. And I think we have the potential for really exciting times. But if we don't get our act together and get unified approaches, then we're not going to fix the supply issue. We're not going to fix the demand issue. And we're going to sort of see same old, same old. So I think we're at an inflection point, and we ought to get our acts together in terms of a unified message, breaking down trade barriers, which include improving the mobility of the workforce, and providing young people with a very exciting and consistent and viable career. I think that's the bigger problem than attracting them. It's keeping them engaged.
Well, that's very interesting. And the word that comes to mind as you talk about this, Hugh, is predictability. And I'll say that up and down the value chain, because as you said, or I'll kind of paraphrase you a little bit, contractors will often tell a project owner, just give me a line of sight on the project, and I'll address any kind of logistical or labor concerns that you have. Just give me that line of sight, and don't hold that carrot so far out, because as a contractor, I can't plan for the vague. I have to plan for the concrete. And so predictability is very important for contractors talking to project owners, but I think you're also emphasizing that predictability is important for workers who are moving through trade school, and they look at this industry and they say, well, is this really, from a technical or an occupational point of view, I love the prospect of being an electrician or a boilermaker or a pipe fitter, but I don't know if I'm going to have consistent work because it seems as though it's hot and cold. Obviously, I don't think you're suggesting, and I don't think that it's possible to sort of pre-plan, how and when projects are sequenced. I think that, again, one of the benefits of a major project initiative is just a general rising of the tide of enthusiasm. But I think what's sobering, you mentioned this, is that at the end of all these points that you and I begun to talk about is the investor.
Yeah.
Who says, okay, I've got money to spend. I need to see a return on my investment. Is it going to be project X or Y or Z? Or is it going to be project A, B, or C in another country because they have more predictability in terms of getting through the regulatory process? So it's a complicated problem.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put words in your mouth, but I think that industry and government have to work together. Sometimes I think that industry points to government and says, you fix it. And then sometimes government says to industry, here's in this case, the major project office putting a bunch of projects on a platter, but just putting a bunch of projects on a green lit button is not necessarily enough, is it, Hugh?
No, it's not enough. And part of it is we get focused on almost busy work that, we spend a lot of time, we invest a lot of money in trying to, as I say, attract people. And yet we're not really focused on the fact that, for example, my own experience is that over the last 2 years, we've been involved in a lot of planning for projects, none of which have gone forward simply because the investors don't see the consistency in the Canadian market. And they'd rather invest in other markets where they feel that there's more certainty in terms of their investment. And so that's where I think government and industry need to get together, talk about things like, Indigenous engagement is not something that you can skip over. It's something that you have to be involved in, but you have to be involved in a much more proactive, less performative way. You need to be involved in ensuring you've got all the environmental guardrails in place. Again, not just checking a box, but realistically getting involved in consultations and good work in that respect. But on the other hand, these things shouldn't take 10 years to get through.
Yeah.
You've got to find a way of doing it expediently. And, I don't see proactivity in this regard. I see it still remains sort of, well, that's just one of the boxes we'll check. We'll engage the Indigenous people after we've got final investment decision. It's like, guys, that's far too late.
Yeah. Well, I'm smiling off camera because, well, you and I have talked about this, but I've also talked about this with quite a few other people, and I'm not pretending that this is a simple matter to resolve, but talking about, sort of not being proactive and kind of being late in the game when it comes to this astonishing figure, which I've also quoted, Hugh, of 40% of total installed cost relates to labor. Why wouldn't that be like number 1 or 2 or 3 in the priority list, rather than coming to a guy like you as a labor strategist or me as the head of an association to say, oh, we've got a big $10 billion project. We've got an FID coming out next month. Let's talk about a labor strategy. Well, that's starting to be too late because, anyways, we can go on about this, but I think that's a glaring challenge that our industry faces is this kind of hurry up and wait some more and then run like a maniac for the final stretch. So it's very frustrating and challenging.
Well, it's funny. We've had a lot of projects where we will get a call and they'll say, we're contemplating a project labor agreement. Can you help us out? And we start asking questions and say, well, when does construction begin? And it began last week. Right. We need 6 months in advance. They just don't get it. I think it's improving, but it's got a long way to go, and yet we can't afford to keep repeating the same issues over and over again. And you're right, it is complicated, but we have more than enough brain power in this country to solve these problems. And you and I have said before, we know what the problems are. We know where the solutions lie, but somehow we're just avoid getting into the discussion.
Yeah. I want to take what you just said a moment ago about, you having this probably all too familiar process of working with a proponent who suddenly announces that construction is about to begin or has already begun, and they're asking you to put together a labor plan. So one side of the labor plan is often the workforce component, but here the other part is the actual labor strategy in respect of what type of workforce and labor affiliation they might have. So let's start talking about labor market stuff, Hugh. I think most of our listeners who are members of PCA obviously know this. They have a relationship with progressive unions like CLAC and perhaps a few others. But you'll remember a time, Hugh, when this industry, particularly in the industrial and kind of institutional sector, was dominated by the building trades. And then we fast forward to the present time, and that domination is no longer there. But I'm not sure, and I wonder what you would say about, do our policymakers understand that shift in labor plurality, building trades, progressive unions, non-union, and the attributes that they bring? Are we still a couple of beats behind in terms of our government officials and bureaucrats understanding the true nature of the labor market, Hugh?
I think we are, and part of the problem is some of the alternative unions. If you look at them individually, apart from the dominance of CLAC and Alberta, you really don't make up enough of the labor market to grab their attention, even though you're a significant actor in the market. And I believe, on another note, that CLAC and ANU and CUSW and CMA and all the alternative unions are impacting on the competitive approach of the building trades, which is a positive thing. However, when it comes to politicians, they're simply looking at what I call nose counts and see, okay, the building trades still have a big number, even though they aggregate around 15% of the total labor force in construction across the country. They're 15% in one spot. The other 85% is distributed in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the 15% get a bigger voice.
Yeah.
And it's all more political than it is the reality of the marketplace. And
Yeah.
so 85% of the people are being shut out a lot of big projects because government policy doesn't seem to understand how the market's made up and how to open up projects so that we get greater participation from all different sources. And this is, I think, probably next to supply, competitiveness is a huge issue. And
Yes.
you probably know, I mean, I advocate that. I have no issue with the building trades. I think that they've done great work. They do great training. Have been a solid force here. I commend them. At the end of the day, we need the competitive approach, and we've got too many building trade unions. I mean, there's just far too many of them. I'd like to see them consolidate. I'd like to see the alternative unions working much more together.
Mm.
And I think consolidation makes a lot of sense in this industry.
Interesting.
Because it's too fractured right now, and it makes it it's so complex.
Yeah.
That for a lot of people, it's easier just to default to the model that they know.
Right.
Even though there may be productivity issues and issues with respect to the consistency of work and all kinds of other things that are aired in a singular labor posture. We can deal with these, but only if we start getting some consolidation. We get some, as I said, a unified approach where people are dropping their ideologies or whatever it is that keep them in these buckets and saying, look, guys, we got a bigger national problem. Let's all get together and drop it. And this is the biggest issue I do have with the building trades is they cling to some kind of ideology that they're somehow better, that they're the real unions, and that's not the case, and I think there are some that are realizing that, hey, we have to change in the future, but that future is still decades off if we don't start challenging government policy that allows for the continuation of monopolies on publicly funded projects and even any large project where, as you said, like just the complexity that gets people to default to models that they know.
Yeah. That's much appreciated, Hugh. One of the things that you said earlier, you alluded to the actual size as opposed to the perceived size of the building trades being around 15%. I would roughly agree with that number, depending on the region.
Yeah.
We often use the number 20, and if we're feeling kind of charitable, we'll use 25%, but probably no more than that. But the interesting thing is that if you go to the building trades national website for the umbrella for all the building trades provincially and regionally, they talk about having 600,000 members. Well, there's only about 1 million skilled trades workers in Canada on the tools. How does that work? If the building trades have close to 2/3 of that, and the fact that non-union sector is gigantic objectively, and then you have this rising tide of alternative unions with their membership, which accounts for something. What's going on with these numbers, Hugh?
Well, to some extent, I mean, the building trades, you take any one of them, they have members that are not in construction, who are in industrial applications. Like a lot of international unions, they diversified and they do representation outside of construction, and in some cases, quite significantly so. Whether it's the operating engineers or the laborers or whoever, they're involved in healthcare and transportation and you name it. So their membership is not reflective of the number of tradespeople they represent. So that's one factor. The other factor, I think, is that for the non-union sector, that there's a large section that we're just not counting because they're not very well organized outside of BC and Alberta, where the independent contractors are doing a fairly decent job of trying to bring them together as a voice. But that effort really doesn't exist in the other 8 provinces to the extent. So I think that there's a large number of people that aren't being accounted for who are in small contractors who simply we're not counting.
Yeah. Well, I think the other point worthy of consideration, which is difficult to nail down properly, is the vagaries of how unions count a person as a quote unquote member. And a member is somebody who is continuing to pay dues to remain in good standing even after they retire, Hugh. And so it's very well possible that quite a few of those 600,000 are retired.
Absolutely.
To their credit, they're still belonging to the union that they've worked for their career, and there's some benefits that are attached to that. But in terms of a functional description of the Canadian workforce, one wonders if 600,000 is a rather long stretch for the building trades to make claim to.
Absolutely is. I mean, you look at like a province like Saskatchewan, there's 2,500 people in the hiring homes.
Right.
2,500 people in a province with a population of 1 million. That's not a very big number.
No. Listen, I want to move on to another topic, but before I do that, you indicated earlier that you have some good impressions of the building trades. You talked about their training, and I would agree with you. I think that there's some recognition that the building trades have really leaned into the training component, and objectively, they're part of building Canada's present, past, and future. What are the elements, particularly now, Hugh, with the sort of the disruptions that are happening across the Canadian-American border with tariffs and so forth, is our renewed desire to kind of make it in Canada. We talked about the nation-building projects. We talked about kind of resolving some interprovincial trade barriers, and kind of refocusing on a Canadian-led strategy. One of the awkward things, Hugh, is that the building trades, they're all international building trades, which, put in a different way, they're based in the States, typically Washington, D.C. How does that look in the present day, Hugh, to have American-based unions, presenting themselves as the proxy for the entire industry in Canada?
I have a significant problem personally with that, and I've written about that very issue. And I look and say, geez, you're an international union supposedly, but in fact you're an American union. And whenever there's going to be a dispute between a Canadian interest and a U.S. interest, the U.S. interest is going to win out in those cases. And I think that is a significant problem.
Yeah.
I also think, I mean, you have issues like in the building trades, a common issue is the trade jurisdiction going on. And ultimately that's dictated by a think tank in Washington. Well, I just, have a personal objection about that kind of reality. It should be done in Canada. And I think too that, our issues are a lot different. I mean, on the one hand, we're a much smaller market, which just gives us a whole different set of issues. But on the other hand, we're significantly more unionized, more labor friendly and whatnot, which means that, our policy directions are going to be different. I can't, I get a little emotional just thinking, like, why are we allowing U.S. interests to be involved in an area that is so critical to Canada's future? I think that there is some independence with the building trade Canadian entities, but at the end of the day, as I said, if there's a dispute, we're not going to win out. And I just have a fundamental problem with that. And to me, and it goes beyond just construction. I look in the industrial world. You have unions that may be involved in the steel industry, for example. Well, we have a trade dispute between us and the U.S. on steel. Well, what are the steelworkers going to do? They're going to favor their larger membership south of the border. And we've had American unions go, yeah, we're all in favor of the trade war. Bring jobs back to America. Well, that's counter to our interests. So why do we allow it? I don't understand it.
Well, let's conclude that point with, I guess, the sober observation that, here we are trying to kind of resuscitate a built-in Canada-led strategy to kind of diversify our interests and consolidate our interests. And as you observe, we have, in this particular case, and there's probably other examples, interests of another country, I'll say, that are potentially distorting what otherwise might have been a perfectly made in Canada solution. So I hear what you're saying there, Hugh. Let's, for our final segment, let's talk about something that many people don't know about. It's a fairly obscure entity in Ontario that deals with the public utilities, particularly nuclear and power. There's an entity that many of our members might know about called the Electrical Power Systems Corporation Association, otherwise known as EPSCA. We have been talking at PCA for quite some time with our concerns about EPSCA. It has a history that goes back many years, but hasn't seemed to innovate and evolve with the times. And as a result, it tends to be a kind of a closed door for competition. You mentioned the importance of competition earlier, Hugh. For our listeners, can you give a thumbnail sketch of your understanding of kind of the history and structure of EPSCA and why that its approach to managing things is problematic?
Yeah, so EPSCA started, like a lot of things, as a really good idea. And it was back in the days when the nuclear industry was just developing in Ontario in the 70s. And they were worried that provincial negotiations in the sector, what's called the institutional, commercial, and industrial sector, would drive the cost up of nuclear plants and other large power installations. So they wanted to segregate that part of the construction industry from ICI in order to make sure that contractors who were negotiating agreements weren't somehow escalating the cost for Ontario Hydro. And Ontario Hydro at the time was actually the largest construction company in the province and one of the largest in the country. So they did it to protect themselves in negotiations. But over time, the market shifted, and and Ontario Hydro was broken up into many different entities. So the amount of owner-led construction activity decreased. But in the meantime, so the interest of EPSCA started shifting away from the owner towards the contractors. And the contractors, of course, have an interest in establishing a monopoly over that work. So that's exactly how it's evolved. It's evolved into this monopoly. And even though it had initial success of containing costs, now costs had actually gone astray in that industry. And it's one of these things that you have to dig deep to really understand this. But the simplicity of it is we've allowed a group of contractors aligned with the building trades a monopoly on significant projects. When we're talking projects that, $5, $7, $10, $12 billion, I mean, these are all massive projects that only can go to building trade contractors. Now, EPSCA will say to you, well, no, I mean, anybody can bid on the work. They just have to follow the EPSCA contract.
Right.
Well, that, de facto is putting you in the building trade world. The building trades are dictating the terms. It's eliminating competition. And no non-union or alternative union contractor wants to take the risk of seeing their labor posture change from what it is today to a building trade.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting because that EPSCA model of, oh, we'll allow others in, has migrated its way into places like BC. Or BC, we're seeing, public projects that say, oh, well, no, they're not restricted to building trades, but you have to follow the building trade collective agreement. Well,
Right.
It's a difference without a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think the government has to start to understand that driving these monopoly situations, affect the cost, they affect productivity. This is one of the reasons why we have these issues. Like, going back to the supply issues, I don't think we would have a supply issue if we solved the productivity issue.
Yes.
Okay? But we're not going to solve the productivity issue if we keep allowing monopoly positions on these massive projects.
Well, what's frustrating, thank you for that breakdown, Hugh. What's frustrating is that, as you allude to, if we open up competition on things like EPSCA or City of Toronto, British Columbia, the community benefit agreements, and there's unfortunately a fairly long list of these kind of monopolistic structures, opening up for competition would generally lower costs, not on the backs of the workers, but just in terms of the strength of innovation that contractors will provide when competing with each other shoulder to shoulder rather than a shrunken group. Workers will get the opportunities, whether they work for building trades or non-union or CLAC, the opportunities will be there. And the other thing, if I may say, Hugh, is that the benefit of also reforming or remodeling these things is on the productivity side, not just the financial productivity, but the labor productivity, is that when you have a monopoly and have only one form of labor, in this case building trades, which is these craft jurisdictions, you don't have the ability to innovate with things like multi-skilling and dual ticketing, where, yes, we need more workers to come into the industry, but the ones that are already in the industry can be used to greater advantage for their own benefit, because if you multi-skill, a worker can be both a scaffolder and an insulator. If you dual ticket, an electrician can pick up, a Boilermaker's ticket or something like that. That's the kind of innovation that I think you and I would agree our industry needs, but I don't think our policymakers understand how the industry works in general, and in particular, how structures like EPSCA are a real productivity drag, an anchor of productivity.
No, exactly. And, I think to the extent that there has been competition, we have seen unions like, the carpenters, for example, with their approach in the West of the National Construction Council, trying to get into a more of a multi-trade kind of approach. It's still meeting with a lot of resistance, and it's, like I said, it's going to be years developing. We need to find a way to actually accelerate that, and that will come with increased competition, as well as I think the proponents really need to understand this and start demanding it from the contractor community and from the union community. They don't seem to. They don't seem to have that appetite for it, and yet, we quoted earlier, 40% of your cost. Okay? But it's more than 40% because that's your variable cost. That's the cost. In terms of productivity goes wrong, the cost of rework starts to factor in, and you start to realize that your cost overruns and your schedule delays and whatnot are labor issues.
Yeah.
It's rarely because, the equipment didn't arrive in time or material didn't arrive in time. No, it's because labor didn't complete the task. We're waiting for, this group to finish so this group can get in. And, we can solve these problems, but, we need to get to the proponents and get to the policymakers to get them to understand this. And this isn't, unfortunately, it becomes sort of a confrontation. Is you're just trying to break down our model and replace it with your model. And that's not the case. As I said, this should not be ideologically driven.
Yeah.
Okay? This is, the hard economic fact is that, it doesn't work. And although the building trades are built on a guild model. The guild model that I think emerged in the 16th century. I think it's about time that it's updated a little bit.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that innovation is key, competition is key. We've covered that in today's discussion, and your latter point, I could not agree more. That both decision makers in government, but also decision makers in investment firms and proponents need to better understand the power of competition between unions, competition between contractors, the innovation that springs from that competition. So I'm very much on board with you there. Hugh, I'm going to wrap it up now, but I'm going to say for our listeners, why don't you describe how people can learn more about Oakbridges, how they might be able to reach you. And as you mentioned earlier, you have a blog channel where you regularly post thought leadership. How can people find out more?
It's easy. Oakbridges.ca is our website. Now, .ca, not .com, .ca for Canada. And we publish on Substack. So just go to Substack and look up Oakbridges Labour Relations Strategy, and you'll find us there. We publish once every 2 weeks. In fact, we publish every Wednesday.
Okay.
And we not only cover things in the construction industry, but we cover industrial relations and labor relations generally. And whatnot. As I said, I've been involved for 45 years, and I just enjoy writing about it. And I still enjoy learning. It's a field that it is very dynamic, but it's also very slow to change. And so if we can get people to start understanding these issues, hopefully we can be more innovative. And there's never been a time that it hasn't been more critical than today.
Yeah.
For Canada. And we're about, the first thing we are is Canadians, and we want to try to help the whole country. And we're not, we really stress that, look, I enjoy working with the building trades. There's some really great people in there. This is not anti-building trades. This is just pro-Canada. And I think the building trades can grow their own numbers and grow their own share of the pie if they start to innovate.
Hugh Secord, thank you for taking the time to talk with us and our listeners today. Once again, thanks for doing this, and I wish you all the well in the best in your work, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you, Hugh.
Absolutely. Keep in touch. Thanks.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent or the program host.